Hello learners, I am Dr. Tejasra Kalita, Assistant Professor Discipline of Philosophy, Krishnakanta Handike, State Open University. Today I am going to discuss about subjective idealism of Berkeley. After going through this unit, we will be able to explain the meaning of subjective idealism, able to describe the subjective idealism of George Berkeley, and you will be able to distinguish between subjective idealism and objective idealism. Now, before going to discuss about the subjective idealism, first we'll have to know what idealism is. So far as the term idealism is concerned, it is something where the systematic philosophy which teaches the supremacy of spirits over matter. It denies the reality of external objects independent of the knowing mind. So far as idealism is concerned, it tries to assert that there is no external reality, everything knowable being a content of consciousness. The mind is the primary reality. Now, the ideas are not representation of external objects independent of our minds. The doctrine of idealism regards the reality as ideal or mind dependent. Idealism takes various forms: subjective idealism of Berkeley, phenomenalistic idealism of Kant, and objective idealism of George Hegel. Now, so far as George Berkeley's idealistic philosophy or idealistic sense is concerned, it tries to teach us that reality consists of spirits and their ideas only. Now, first, before entering into the subjective idealism of George Berkeley, first we'll know what subjective idealism is. Now, subjective idealism is a philosophical view which is based on the idea that nothing exists except through a perceiving mind. In this view, the natural world has no real existence as such. It only exists in the mind of those who perceive it. Subjective idealism denies the existence of external objects and reduces them to the subjective ideas of the finite minds that perceive them. Finite minds and their ideas are the only realities, and there is no world outside. This is what we can say that subjective idealism is. Now, when George Berkeley says about subjective idealism, he always says that subjective idealism is something which arose as a logical consequences of the most unpsychological distinction of qualities into primary and secondary, which was made by John Locke. Now, Berkeley developed the empiricism of John Locke to its logical consequences in idealism. Locke holds that we cannot directly perceive the external objects but can only have an indirect knowledge of their existence through the idea which are the effects of those effects. If the substance in which the primary qualities inhere is unknown, as Locke maintains, we cannot even say that it exists. Berkeley therefore concludes that our mind and their ideas are only realities and there is no world outside of it. Now, so far as objects are concerned, they have no external existence apart from the mind that knows them. Hence, Berkeley argues that the existence of a thing consists in its being perceived, which is called by him to be esse ist perceivi. To be is to be perceived, or something is to be or if something is exists is to be perceived or known. The existence of extra mental matter is only a dogmatic and superfluous assumption. Instead of supposing that mind is in the world, we have rather to suppose that the world is in the mind itself. Now, this position is often classified as subjective idealism. Berkeley's subjective idealism is something called materialism, since Berkeley claims that all that is real is associated with our mind. That is, everything which is real is nothing but mental. It is called immaterialism since he denies the reality of material substance. His doctrine is also called spiritualism since he believes only in the reality of spirits and the infinite spirit and their ideas. Thus, it is seen that according to this theory, there is no extramental matter and only minds or spirits with their ideas actually exist. Now, so far as Berkeley is concerned, he tries to reject any distinction between primary and secondary qualities. John Locke thought primary qualities, that is weight, extension, solidity, etc., to be subjective states of our mind. So far as Berkeley's view is concerned, he offers the following argument for the subjectivity of primary qualities. First, if the secondary qualities, namely color, taste, etc., cannot exist except in relation to our sensibility and are therefore ideas of our mind, the primary qualities, extension, weight, solidity, etc., are ideas of our mind only, since they are also perceived by our mind. Okay. Now, secondly, if the primary qualities like the secondary qualities appear different to different persons, a stone that appears heavy to one may appear light to another person. Thirdly, primary qualities and the secondary qualities cannot be perceived apart from each other. It is impossible to conceive and extend a thing without any color or color without any extension. Thus, to Berkeley, all the qualities primary and secondary are subjective only. Berkeley again says that an object can never be perceived apart from its extension. He again says that it is impossible for me to see or feel anything without an actual sensation of that thing. So it is impossible for me to conceive in my thought any sensible thing or object distinct from the sensation or perception of it. In truth, the object and sensation are same thing and cannot therefore be abstracted from each other. An object can never be perceived apart from its sensation. Therefore, a perceived object is identical with a sensation and it has no existence outside of our mind. Berkeley's assumption that the world of object does not exist apart from our perceiving mind raises some important questions. If things be only ideas in our mind, will they cease to exist when we cease to think of them? It appears at first from what has been said by Berkeley that they do not exist independently of our thought. How can we explain the apparent objectivity, independent, permanent, and unity of the world consistency with this theory? Berkeley answers that such questions fully in his later writings by shifting his ground of idealism from the finite mind to the infinite mind. So far as Berkeley's view is concerned, he always tries to say that in order to explain the permanence and unity of the system of ideas which we call the world, we must assume an absolute and universal mind in whose thought it is transferred to and partially reproduced in the finite minds of man. Thus, things are ideas of the divine mind. Human perception means rendering explicit of what lying implicit in the divine mind. Berkeley, in his earlier writings, sometimes speaks as if the world has no existence except in our finite minds. God creates or raises in our minds the ideas which constitute things, and these ideas exist only in our own mind, where God created the world as a system or ideas in the minds of man merely, so that the world has no existence except as a system of human ideas. This is complete subjective idealism because according to it, world exists only subjectively in finite minds. Berkeley, in his later writings, distinctly says that God creates and sustains the world as a system of ideas within his own mind, and that our perception is a reproduction from a finite point of view of the ideas of the divine mind. This view of Berkeley gives an objective existence of the world also. Berkeley's contention that the object depends on the mind's knowing has been severely criticized by different schools of realists of the present day. According to realists, the object exists. It is independent of the mind and its knowledge of it. Its existence is not affected by the mind's knowledge of it. Assists perceive it means that being is and therefore it is perceived. If there were no being or object, it would not be perceived. Its being does not consist in being perceived as Berkeley erroneously supposed. It is perceived because there is being or existence of the object. Knowing is a subjective mental state, but it refers to an object independent of it. Berkeley argues that whenever we perceive an object, such like blue, we perceive a sensation of the object at the same time. we can never separate the two from each other in actual perception. So they must be identical with each other. The sensible object, that is blue, which I am perceiving, must be identical with the sensation of the blue. According to Berkeley, blue and the sensation of blue are identical with each other because they can never be perceived apart from each other. But it has been pointed out to Berkeley that inseparability in perception does not prove identity. If A and B cannot be perceived or conceived apart from each other, it does not prove that they are identical with each other. From inseparability, identity does not follow. It is also true that the things which we know exist in a cognitive relation to us. From this point, we cannot say that they cannot exist outside this relation. It is also true that we cannot know everything about things unperceived, but it does not mean that there are no unperceived things. Hume believes in this point. Hume believes that solipsism is one of the most logical outcome of the Berkeley's doctrine of assessed perceiving. Solipsism affirms that I and my ideas alone exist. If to be real, to be perceived, then the only real things from anyone would be one's own mind and experiences. So Hume developed Berkeley's idealism to solipsism. But Berkeley maintains that the sensation in our mind depends on God. Thus, the conception of God saves Berkeley's philosophy from lapsing into solipsism. But the way in which God has been introduced into his philosophy seems to prove the weaknesses of his doctrine. Purely subjective idealism is therefore untenable. Thus, due to the defects involved in the subjective idealism of Berkeley, it cannot be accepted as a true theory of explaining the nature and object of pure knowledge. Now, we'll discuss Berkeley's idealism. So, whether it can be said to be subjective or objective. So far as George Berkeley is concerned, he is an eminent idealist, denies the existence of any transcendent experimental reality. According to him, material bodies are only ideas. Their existence consists in being perceived by some mind. But Berkeley held the reality, externality, and permanence of the real world on the basis of divine perception. Now, the question is, how are we to characterize Berkeley's idealism? Is it subjective or objective? To answer this question, we must understand precisely the meaning of the two expressions, subjective idealism and objective idealism. So far as subjective idealism is concerned, subjective idealism taken in the strictest sense means that the world of things has no existence except the consciousness of finite minds. In other words, it implies that the world exists only as a system of ideas, the minds of finite subjects. So far as objective idealism is concerned, on the other hand, it again taken in the strictest sense means that the world exists objectively or independently of finite minds, but it is evolved by and contained in the universal mind of God. In other words, it implies that the world is created and sustained by God as a system of ideas. His own ideas and that our perception consist in the reproduction of the ideas of the divine mind in our own mind. If this is to be true distinction between subjective idealism and objective idealism, then Berkeley's earlier theory may be called subjective and his later theory can be regarded to be objective idealism only. But it has become customary to regard Berkeley's theory, whether in its earlier or later form, as subjective idealism and to look upon the idealistic theory of Hegel and Neo-Hegelian as the true form of objective idealism. Critics of Berkeley have raised the questions whether Berkeley is to be regarded as a subjective or objective idealist. A few admirers of Berkeley have considered to Berkeley's idealism an objective character in view of the later development of his philosophy, though, however, the majority of the critics are of the opinion that idealism of Berkeley lacks that fuller connotation which objective idealism of Hegel and his followers has acquired. Now, let us examine how Hegelian theory differs from the later Berkeleyan theory. Like the Berkeleyan theory in its latest phase, the Hegelian theory also supposed that the world is evolved from, sustained by, and included within the well-embracing energy and consciousness of God or the absolute mind. But in Hegelian idealism, the absolutism and maintenance of a world of things are contained in a very natural nature of God or the absolute, that the existence of a world is essential to its concrete self-conscious life. God realizes himself to a concrete self-conscious subject in and through the world of object evolves and sustained by himself. God or the absolute idea by self-differentiation and self-objectification make itself into the world of things and mind. The relation between the absolute idea and the world of things and minds is such that the one cannot be without the other. Now, if these be the fundamental points of the conception of objective idealism, we cannot call Berkeley's idealism objective one. Berkeley and his followers assume that God as a thinking subject may exist without the world as the object, and that the existence of a world as of things is not at all essential for the inseparable of his own conscious life, but is dependent on an act of choice on his part. Hence, their theory may be called subjective, though in a different sense. It may be concluded that Berkeley's idealism remains subjective in spite of its attempt to be objective. Now, let us see what is solipsism, or can Berkeley's theory can be regarded to be solipsist, or Berkeley can be regarded to be a solipsist. Now, the word solipsism has been derived from two Latin words, souls and ifs, meaning myself alone. According to solipsism, I and my ideas alone exist. That is, I am certain of my own existence and of my ideas which are real. I do not know anything beyond myself and my ideas. Each person is shut up to himself alone. Solus ipse. The question has been raised whether Berkeley was a solipsist. It is true that Berkeley affirms that all that is real is mental. But from this, we cannot say that he is a solipsist. Berkeley is not a solipsist, as he believes that experience is a result of an external activity and not of our own solely. He depends on God to escape from the magic circle of the self, as he believes that the God is the cause of all our sensation. The sensations are excited in the finite minds by gods according to certain fixed laws. Again, certain sensations are produced in us by other finite spirit, and our belief in the existence and our communication with them are guaranteed by our faith in God. Thus, the conception of God saves Berkeley's philosophy from lapsing into solipsism. So, this is in brief in the subjective idealism of George Berkeley. Now, let us see what we have already done in this particular lecture. Now, so far as subjective idealism is concerned, we can say that it is a philosophical view based on the idea that nothing exists except through a perceiving mind. The external world exists in the mind of those who perceive it. George Berkeley, a distinguished idealist, denies the existence of any transcendent extramental reality. Berkeley says that our minds and their ideas are the only realities, and there is no world outside of it. Now, so far as Berkeley ideas are concerned, he always argues that the existence of a thing consists in its being perceived, which he called esse ist percipi, to be or to exist is to be perceived or to be known. So far as Berkeley's subjective idealism is concerned, it is something called mentalism. Why? Immaterialism and spiritualism, because according to this theory, there is no extra mental matter and only minds or spirit with the ideas exist. Berkeley says that in order to explain the permanence and the unity of the system of ideas which call the world, we must assume that absolute and universal mind in whose thought it exists permanently and from the whose thought it is transferred to and partially reproduced in the finite minds of man. Thus, things are ideas of the divine mind. Berkeley argues that whenever we perceived an object that which I have given the example of blue, we perceived a sensation of that particular object at the same time. We can never separate the two from each other in actual perception. So, the sensible object which I call blue must be identical with the sensation of blue because they can never be perceived apart from each other. Again, so far as Hume is concerned, he always believed solipsism to be the logical outcome of Berkeley's doctrine of assessed perception. Solipsism affirms that I and my ideas alone exist. If to be real, to be perceived, then the only real things for anyone would be one's own mind and experience. So Hume developed Berkeley's idealism to solipsism. So far as subjective idealism is concerned, it is found that it has taken in the strictest sense means that the world of things has no existence except in the consciousness of the finite minds. Objective idealism, on the other hand, taken the strictest sense, and it says that the world exists objectively or independently of our finite minds, but it is evolved by and contained in the universal of God. In Hegelian idealism, the evolution of and maintenance of the world of things are contained in the very nature of the God or the absolute. That the existence of a world is essential to his concrete self-conscious life. Berkeley and his followers assume that God as a thinking subject may exist without a world as an object, that the existence of a world things is not at all essential or indispensable to his conscious life, but is dependent on an act of choice on his part. The word solipsism has been derived from two Latin words solus and ipse, meaning myself alone. Berkeley is not a solipsist. He believes that experience is a result of an external activity and not of our own solely. He depends on God to escape from the magic circle of the self. The conception of God saves Berkeley's philosophy from lapsing into solipsism. So we have learned that so far as Berkeley's subjective idealism is concerned, Berkeley's subjective idealism is something which is different from Hegelian concept of objective idealism. Subjective idealism and objective idealism both believes that our mind is something, reality is something which is dependent on our mind. If we have to know something, for that mind, if something is real, and it has to be there in our mind itself. I mean, if something is to exist, it is something which is dependent on our mind. But why it is called subjective idealism? Because Berkeley has given more emphasis on the spatial quality of one's own ideas of that particular thing. He believes that whatever is true, it is true because it is something which is related to our mind. For example, I can give here an example. Suppose I am suffering from toothache. He says that toothache is something which is real to me and which is there in my mind. One person who is standing just near me, he even cannot realize what is toothache because he is not suffering from that. But it does not mean that toothache does not exist. It exists and it is something which is perceived by my own self. I think you have understood what I try to mean by Berkeley's conception of idealism. So though we have found that there are a lot of criticism are there in context of Berkeley's subjective idealism, but in all the cases we always cannot say that Berkeley was always wrong. In many cases we can even justify the conception of subjective idealism which was given by George Berkeley. So this is in brief about the subjective idealism of Berkeley. And I think you have understood the whole concept of subjective idealism, which was presented by George Berkeley, and how it is different from objective idealism and how it is different from solipsism. So this is in brief about the subjective idealism, and I think all of you have been benefited from this particular video. Thank you so much.